All right, settle in. We are about to jump headfirst into, well, a truly remarkable historical document. Our source today: Castes and Tribes of Southern India, Volume I, A, and B, published by the government press, Madras, all the way back in 1909.
Yeah, and think of this book as this really ambitious attempt, to capture a complex world at a specific moment. It's ethnographic,
Right.
detailing customs, origins, beliefs, uh, daily lives of just a huge array of communities across southern India, from like well-known Brahmins to tons of distinct local groups.
And our mission in this deep dive is basically to act as your guides, pulling out the most surprising facts, the essential context, and, well, the really compelling insights from this dense work.
Yeah, cutting through the detail.
Exactly. We want to help you cut through it and become instantly, well, pretty well informed about this fascinating period in place.
And what's immediately clear, I think, from the author's preface is just how challenging this research actually was back then.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, imagine trying to gather detailed information across vast distances, early 20th century, often encountering suspicion or even outright fear from the people you hope to study.
You really see it in the anecdotes he includes, don't you? People literally running away from his, scientific instruments.
The anthropometric tools?
Local barbers fleeing a town because they were scared, or subjects suspicious that receiving a coin meant some kind of binding contract, or even ritual pollution.
Yeah, pollution they had to purify away. It's quite something.
So despite these huge hurdles, the scattered information, the travel limits, the resistance, this work somehow managed to compile an astonishing amount of specific detail.
It did. It gives us this unique window, really. So let's maybe unpack some of those early challenges first.
Yeah, so diving into that preface, this 1909 publication in Madras, what exactly was the stated aim, and how did those practical challenges really shape the outcome?
Well, the author, Edgar Thurston, his aim was to investigate tribes and castes using the tools they had then. So anthropometry.
Measuring bodies, basically.
Right, physical characteristics alongside his own personal observation. But, and this is key, he couldn't possibly cover the entire Madras presidency and parts of Mysore himself. Just too vast.
So he had to rely on others.
Exactly. He relied heavily on synthesizing existing, often scattered, published sources, which, has its own limitations.
Yeah, it sounds like even the direct investigation he could do was, well, often met with suspicion. That story about the tintometer, the skin color measuring thing, that's pretty wild.
It truly is. A man was so frightened by it that he literally threw his body cloth at Thurston's feet and just fled.
Wow.
It really highlights the cultural gulf, maybe the mistrust the researchers sometimes faced. Even simple things, like you said, offering a coin,
Yeah.
could be totally misinterpreted, leading one man to offer it to a village goddess, along with flowers and a coconut, because he thought the money itself carried pollution.
And you mentioned barbers fleeing, too. What was that about?
Yes. In one instance, the local head official apparently had to apologize for his scrubby chin, his unshaven appearance.
Ah,
Yeah, because the town's barbers had just vanished when the ethnographer arrived, presumably out of fear or, some kind of suspicion.
so these aren't just quirky stories. They're real practical obstacles.
Absolutely. They limited direct research and forced that reliance on other information, which might have been, less reliable sometimes.
So a key insight right from the start is that this massive work, while it's incredibly detailed, it's also very much a product of its time and the significant practical limits on gathering information directly from the people themselves.
Precisely. And Thurston is, to his credit, pretty honest about that reliance on sometimes scattered or secondhand accounts. He also notes, interestingly, that these societies weren't static. He sees changes already happening. Things like indigenous jewelry being replaced by imported beads, or the abolition of the marry a human sacrifice rite being replaced by, animal sacrifice instead. So this document captures a moment of transition as well as tradition.
Okay, let's move from the challenges of the research itself to the findings. How did the author and I guess his contemporaries try to understand the origins and physical characteristics of all these diverse groups?
Right. So this is where we really get into the scientific ideas of the era. For example, just the terminology itself shifted. The language family, originally called Tamulic, was renamed Dravidian by Bishop Caldwell.
Why was that?
To avoid confusion with the specific Tamil language itself, make it broader.
Gotcha. And they put a lot of stock in physical measurements, didn't they? Craniometry, head measuring, and all that. Anthropometry was central.
Absolutely central. They meticulously recorded measurements like the cephalic index, that's the ratio of head width to length, basically gives you head shape.
Long-headed versus broad-headed, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And the nasal index, looking at nose shape, the whole idea was to classify groups and maybe even link them based on these physical traits.
And there was even debate, wasn't there, about what a typical Dravidian head actually looked like.
Yes, there was. Earlier theories suggested Dravidians were mostly broad-headed or brachycephalic, while, say, groups like the Todas were long-headed dolichocephalic.
But Thurston found something different.
Well, his own measurements on a pretty large sample showed an average cephalic index leaning more towards dolichocephalic, long-headed. So that challenged some of the prevailing ideas at the time. They also measured jungle tribes, compared different Brahmin communities across regions, lots of data gathering.
And these physical traits were sometimes used to propose really, really sweeping connections between populations, even across continents.
Yes, and this raises, an important point about the speculation of the time. There were these theories floating around that southern India might have been a kind of corridor.
A passage ground.
Yeah, a passage ground for the ancestors of groups found further north, maybe even linked somehow to Mediterranean populations. It sounds a bit out there now, but that was part of the thinking.
And that theory connecting Aboriginal Australians, Dravidians, and even Europeans, that sounds like quite a stretch today.
It really does, viewed from our modern understanding of genetics and population history. But based on the limited comparative data they had back then, researchers did explore this possibility.
What was their evidence, or perceived evidence?
Well, they cited things like a few shared words that might have had common roots, the use of boomerang-like weapons by some Dravidian tribes, and even geological speculation about past land bridges connecting India towards Austramalaya.
Wow, okay.
And this led to ideas about a pre-Dravidian population, sometimes called Negriparia, which was imagined as this older, long-headed, darker-skinned layer of ancestry based mostly on skull analysis.
So the key insight here is really how the scientific methods of the time, especially anthropometry, were used maybe sometimes speculatively to build these theories of origin and relationship. Theories that, seem quite dated or even problematic now.
Exactly. But they reflected the prevailing scientific paradigm. It shows the ideas people were wrestling with to try and make sense of human diversity over a century ago.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. How did these communities actually organize themselves internally? Manage their affairs, live by certain rules?
Right, and this is where the book just reveals this incredible complexity of social structure. It doesn't just list main castes and tribes, but numerous subdivisions, septs.
Septs? What are those exactly?
They're typically exogamous kinship groups, meaning you have to marry someone from outside your own sept. Keeps things mixed up, genealogically speaking.
Okay.
And then you have gotras, often linked to specific priestly lineages. The book gives examples of sept names like Anam, Avula, Bali, Bana. Just lists them out.
And leadership sounds like it was very decentralized, very specific to each group.
Very much so. You see this wide variety of local leaders with all sorts of different titles. There's the Monagar for the Badagas, the Nayako for Aruvas and Bagatas, the Naidu or Dora for the Boyas Bedars, many others.
So not just one system.
Not at all. And alongside these sort of secular headmen, you had really important religious figures, gurus, for various castes and sects. That includes different types of Brahmins, but also non-Brahmin preceptors like Jangams or Pandurams.
The caste panchayat, the community council, that sounds like it was absolutely central to social control.
Oh, it was fundamental. The source describes these councils meeting, sometimes quite formally, like symbolically on a blanket with water and margosa leaves to show how serious it was.
And they had real power.
Absolutely. Power to settle disputes, handle everything from property matters to adultery, impose fines, and crucially, the power of excommunication. Being kicked out of the community was a huge deal.
And the fines could be tied to a person's wealth. That's interesting.
For some groups, yeah, like the Bad Hoys. The fine amount was adjusted based on how prosperous the individual was. And the money collected might be used for the castemen themselves, maybe feasts, or sometimes given to a temple.
Did they have ways to determine guilt?
Sometimes, yes. Some castes apparently even used ordeals in really serious matters. Things like picking a coin out of boiling ghee or oil. Pretty intense.
Wow. And inheritance rules. They weren't uniform either, right? They varied a lot.
That's another key takeaway, absolutely. You find both patriarchal systems property passing father to son called Makala Santana.
Which is maybe what we'd think of as more standard.
Perhaps. But you also find matriarchal systems, Alia Santana, where property passes from uncle to nephew, but through the female line. This was prominent among groups like the Bants.
Any idea why?
Well, the book notes it's sometimes linked to contexts where men might have been away frequently, maybe for military service or long trading journeys. The property stayed within the mother's lineage.
Okay, so the key insight here is just the sheer diversity and the kind of localized nature of governance and social rules. You've got community councils with significant power and fundamental things like inheritance varying dramatically between groups.
Absolutely. It really shows that southern India wasn't some single social entity. It was a mosaic, a patchwork of distinct communities, each with its own intricate systems.
Let's move to what seem like perhaps the most detailed sections of the book, the customs around the human life cycle. Birth, marriage, death. The level of granularity here is just striking.
It really is. It offers this fascinating glimpse into the rituals that mark these huge moments in life. For birth, you get details like the Brahman naming ceremony, often involving cutting a lock of hair, and the specific role a barber might play in that.
And puberty seems to be marked with very specific, sometimes quite unusual ceremonies, too.
Yes, definitely. The Agasa washerman, for instance, had this peculiar duty. It was his job to carry the news of a girl wife's first menstruation to her husband's parents. And Badhois had periods of seclusion for girls. Badaga women used a separate hut, the Holagudi or menstrual hut, and observed 5 days of pollution. They couldn't even fully re-enter the main house until they saw the crescent moon.
Marriage age also seems to have varied quite a bit.
Right. The book documents both adult marriage, common among groups like Agamudayans, Badagas, Bilovas, and infant marriage, practiced by others, sometimes even within the same broad community.
So it wasn't one rule for everyone.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And the age when a girl was married, whether it was before or after puberty, is noted as a really significant difference for groups like, say, the Kapos or Belishas.
And the marriage rituals themselves, they sound incredibly rich and varied.
Oh, they are. Some were relatively simple, like among poor Agamudayans, where it's actually the groom's sister who ties the
marriage necklace.
Yeah, the sacred necklace symbolizing the marriage. But then others were far more complex.
Yeah.
You have this mock marriage for unmarried adult Aliyah girl.
A mock marriage.
Yeah, to a brass vessel or even an arrow, presumably
right.
to deal with the social status of being an unmarried adult woman. Then there's the Mbatan barber officiating at Konga Velala weddings, which is interesting role crossing.
Right.
Elaborate use of trays with specific articles, canopies, anointing pastes for balijas and badars. Symbolic acts like exchanging betel leaves or searching for a nose ornament hidden in a milk vessel among the badars.
The Brahmin wedding rites sound particularly dense with ritual meaning.
They are described in really significant detail. Worship of specific deities, the Ankurapana or seed pan ceremony, which involves sprouting grains to ensure prosperity.
Okay.
Symbolic acts like treading on a stone for stability, offerings of fried patty, removing a girdle, and even this fascinating, really unique third marriage ceremony.
A third marriage?
Yeah, for Brahmins, apparently sometimes performed using the arka plant as a substitute bride, maybe to avert bad luck associated with a third marriage or potential widowhood.
Wow. And there's strict rules about who could marry whom, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. Rules about needing to marry someone from a different gotra, those lineage groups, or specific seps or titles within a caste.
Like the exogamous seps you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. And even for some Badaga villages, a rule of village exogamy, meaning you had to marry outside your own village. It just shows how heavily these social structures regulated marriage choices.
What about the end of life? Death and mourning customs?
Again, lots of detail. The source covers both cremation and burial practices. It often depended on the specific group, where sometimes the age of the deceased children might be buried when adults were cremated.
And pollution periods?
Yes, those varied significantly. 9 days for Bandaras, 11 for Balavas, for example. And then there were final ceremonies, like the puja, which seems to have been a purification and feasting ritual, kind of similar to one practiced by the Bants, held on specific days after death, like the 16th day.
Any particularly striking or unique death customs that jumped out at you?
Oh, several stand out. The Badaga buffalo ceremony before the pyre is one.
What did that involve?
Well, sometimes it included this ritual to symbolically transfer the deceased person's sins onto a calf, which was then driven away.
Wow, literally scapegoating.
In a sense, yeah. Then there's the Belavakel Dapuni, or driving away the ghost ceremony. This was done for deaths considered inauspicious.
How did they drive away the ghost?
It involved collecting the ashes, looking for marks in them, specifically trying to find marks resembling cloven feet, which would indicate the ghost's presence, and then performing rituals with a magician to banish it.
Ah, it's incredible.
And the detail about Brahmin funeral rites being based on the Garuda Purana scripture, beliefs about libations of water helping the soul grow a new body for its difficult journey, the critical importance of the annual srad or ancestral ceremony.
Failing to do that could lead to excommunication.
Apparently, yes, it was considered a vital duty. And even the practice of offering rice balls to crows after the funeral, seeing if they eat it as an omen for the deceased soul.
The image of the Badaga messenger announcing a death, removing his turban, and yelling, "Do! Do!" That's just incredibly specific.
It really captures the local ways of communicating these huge life events.
Yeah.
I think the key insight from this whole life cycle section is just the astonishing diversity and specificity of ritual practice across all these communities, reflecting these deep-seated beliefs about purity, social status, fate, the afterlife, all of it.
Moving on to beliefs and rituals more broadly, the book reveals this rich tapestry of religious practices, from worshiping major deities to very local spirits and really complex ritual systems.
Yes, you definitely see affiliations with the major branches of Hinduism, Vaishnavism, focused on Vishnu, and Saivism, focused on Shiva, sometimes both coexisting within the same caste group. It also notes groups with historical ties to Jainism, like the Bants, and some links to Islam.
And the sheer number of deities mentioned is just vast.
It really is. You've got the major Puranic deities like Vishnu, Shiva, Gauri, but then also countless local village deities, protective spirits, figures specific to certain castes, like the Badagas Swami or Mahalinga Swami or the Bilavas Bhutas.
Bhutas, like spirits or ghosts.
Sort of ancestral or nature spirits, yeah. Very important in Tulunadu culture. Even some Brahmin sects focused worship on very specific forms, like the Konkani Brahmins, venerating a silver plate image of Venkataramana of Tirupati.
Certain sacred objects seem to hold immense significance across different groups as well.
This is definitely a key takeaway. The sacred thread, for instance, worn by Brahmins and some other groups like Bhattarajas. The book describes it in detail, the type of cotton, the specific knots representing Brahma, Vishnu, Rudra.
And its importance for status.
Right. Its necessity for full ritual status as a Brahmin. Then you have salagrama stones.
Ah, yes, you mentioned these. Fossil ammonites.
Exactly. Naturally occurring fossils primarily worshipped by Vaishnavites as manifestations of Vishnu.
And the description of them is particularly detailed, isn't it? How they were valued, tested for luck, even showing up in court cases.
Yes. The book goes into quite a bit of detail about prized shapes, how stones were supposedly tested for their auspiciousness, some believed to bring luck, others ruin. And it notes a specific court case involving salagrama stones around the time of the Ilbert Bill debate.
What does that show?
It shows just how deeply embedded these objects were in daily life. Concepts of property, religious identity, and even interactions with the colonial legal system. Other important objects include the Chank shell for libations and temple music, Rudraksha beads used by Saivites, and sacred plants like Tulsi and Bilva associated with different deities.
And the rituals themselves, they cover everything from daily prayers to big public festivals?
Right. Daily Brahmin practices like chanting the Gayatri mantra, making Arghya offerings, performing Sandhya and Tarpana rituals, offering water to gods, sages, ancestors, with specific ways of holding the sacred thread, all described. There's mention of reciting the Purusha Sukta hymn, which is fundamental in Brahmin belief for explaining the origin of the social divisions, or varnas. Temple worship details cover the role of priests, the archakas, the hierarchy of offerings, how holy water, thirtham, and blessed food, prasadam, are distributed, including the symbolic placing of the sitari bowl on devotees' heads.
That description of the temple car festival, the Rafa, with the obscene carvings on it to ward off the evil eye, that's one of those really unexpected details that sticks with you.
It's a fascinating example, isn't it? Practical superstition, maybe, interwoven right into formal religious practice. Other rituals like firewalking, sometimes linked to agricultural success for groups like the Muller Badagas and the sectarian branding.
Branding?
Yeah, practiced by some Vaishnavites, particularly Madhvas, marking their bodies, usually on the arms or chest, with heated metal stamps bearing symbols like the chakram, discus, and sankha, conch. It highlights the diversity of devotional practices and sect identities.
And the source seems absolutely full of origin stories and legends explaining why things are the way they are for different groups.
Oh, these narratives are crucial for understanding cultural identity back then. Stories like the Indra and Ahalya legend being linked to the origin of the Gamudayan, Muravan, and Kalan castes. Or the Gauri story for the Badagas involving a river crossing and sacrifice.
Great.
The dramatic Sankaracharya legend about him supposedly eating forbidden food and swallowing red-hot iron used to explain the status of Havyeka Brahmins. or the many versions of the Balava folk heroes, Koti and Chennaya. These stories provide justifications, history, moral lessons, all within the community.
So the key insight from this whole section is really the vibrant and incredibly multi-layered nature of religious belief and practice, where ancient traditions, local deities, specific sacred objects, complex rituals, and explanatory legends are all interwoven, providing this deep spiritual and social framework for life.
Precisely. It's a world where the sacred was just deeply, deeply integrated into the everyday fabric of existence.
Okay, beyond the rituals and beliefs, the book also gives us a window into, well, the practicalities of daily life and the incredible variety of occupations people held.
It really does. It lists such a wide range of jobs. You see the prevalence of cultivators, farmers like the Agamudayans and Badagas, the critical role of trading castes like the Balijas and Berichettis, who were major merchants.
And essential services, too.
Right, essential service providers like barbers, ambatans, and washermen, agasas, banas, fishermen like the Besta, village watchmen, the Amalakarens, and various roles within temples, from musicians to priests like archakas or pujaris, sometimes drawn from specific non-Brahmin castes too, like bilavas.
And some more maybe unique or specific occupations mentioned.
Yes, definitely. There are bards and minstrels, the Batrazu or Patrajas, who are really important for preserving genealogies and folklore through performance. You have nomadic groups and beggars, including the Budu-Budaik fortune tellers, known for their distinctive double-headed drum sound.
Okay.
Moneylenders, and those serving in civil or military roles, like sepoys or constables, among the Bondili caste. Even specific artists are mentioned by name, like Vembu Achari, noted as an albino sculptor and craftsman.
It even touches on details about what people ate or wore.
Yeah. The source notes food habits, including which groups consumed meat, fish, or alcohol, which wasn't universal by any means. It highlights some surprising details, like certain sections of Havyaka and Oriya Brahmins apparently eating meat and fish, which contrasts with the more commonly known vegetarian Brahmin practices.
Interesting.
And clothing details, too, like the use of specific garments, maybe petticoats for Balija women, or a kind of smock frock-like garment worn by some Boya men, little details like that.
And the objects people used in daily life add to the picture, too.
Definitely. From the, scientific instruments the author brought with him to the cheroots people smoked, the combs they used, sometimes elaborately decorated, those boomerang-like throwing sticks used by some tribal groups, specific items like a ceremonial ladle, the Desai's ladle indicating rank, or even steel tweezers just for pulling out thorns. It helps paint a picture of the material culture alongside the social practices.
Social interactions are also noted sometimes, like concubinage or the different perceptions of religious versus non-religious begging.
Right. The key takeaway here, I think, is the sheer diversity of livelihoods and the concrete details of material culture and daily habits that really distinguished these groups from one another, reflecting their environment, their historical roles, their specific social rules.
Okay, so while all these detailed descriptions are incredibly valuable, it's often the specific, really memorable anecdotes that truly bring this historical document to life, isn't it? They feel like the human moments captured within all the ethnographic data.
Absolutely. These are the nuggets that make you really pause and try to imagine the scene. Like that man terrified of the tintometer, just running away, throwing his cloth down.
Yeah. Or the official whose shave was delayed because the town barber literally fled out of fear.
Exactly. Or the man offering Thurston's coin to a goddess because he thought it carried pollution. It just vividly illustrates that clash of cultures and beliefs, the misunderstandings that could happen.
The detail about Mr. Vincent seeing a comb with a clock face scratched onto it. It's such a small, specific human touch in the middle of all the classification.
It is. And the accounts of albinos, like that sculptor Vembu Achari, being socially accepted, marrying within their communities, having children, that maybe challenges some potential assumptions about how physical differences were treated historically.
The mock marriage for Aliya girls you mentioned, or the Agasa washerman's unique duty carrying news of puberty. These are customs that feel so specific, so real, you couldn't easily invent them.
Right. Or the Mbatan barber officiating and tying the tali at a Kongavelala wedding. Another one of those unexpected details about overlapping roles between castes. And while it's grim, the note about village midwives sometimes causing uterine ailments through rough treatment, that highlights the very real risks tied to traditional practices back then.
The visual of the unopened caste panchayat meeting on a blanket with water and margosa leaves, It's such a powerful image of how justice and social order were actually maintained at the local level.
And some anecdotes speak to really deep cultural values, don't they? Like that Badaga suicide story, the man jumping his horse off a waterfall, supposedly due to shame over how rice was served at a feast.
Wow.
Or the Badaga buffalo sacrifice and that sin transfer ritual with the calf, highlighting their beliefs about oaths, testimony, and the fate of the soul after death.
The Balava ceremony, searching for cloven feet, marks in the ashes to identify a ghost after an inauspicious death. That is wonderfully specific. It reveals their unique way of handling fear and the supernatural.
And the Bant buffalo races, judged partly on the height of the splash the buffalo makes. It's just a delightful glimpse into leisure activities and competition.
Yeah.
Or the idea of a Vira Mushti mendicant having the power to forbid certain vegetables being grown in a trader's backyard. It just shows these unexpected layers of social influence and religious authority.
And finally, that story of the Betrayzus. A specific group identified sometimes with criminal activity, disguising themselves as Brahmins to steal, even carrying sacred items like salagrama stones to keep up the facade. That's like something straight out of a historical drama.
It really is. These anecdotes, while sometimes just brief mentions in the text, they act like little flashlights, don't they? Illuminating the complexities, the beliefs, the human realities within the broader descriptions of all these castes and tribes.
Wow. Okay, taking this deep dive into castes and tribes of southern India, just through volume 1 really has been quite the journey. From understanding the immense challenges the original author faced just gathering the information,
Yeah, the practical difficulties.
to exploring the incredibly intricate details of social structure, life cycle rituals, those diverse religious beliefs, and just the texture of daily life back then.
Yes, it's a vivid picture. Sometimes challenging, definitely, given the colonial context and the methods, but ultimately a fascinating glimpse into the incredible diversity and complexity of life in southern India over a century ago. You really see communities shaped by tradition, but also adapting to changing times, each with their own unique practices, hierarchies, ways of seeing the world, all captured in this painstaking, sometimes overwhelming detail.
And you get a real sense of how integrated everything was, don't you? Your
Yeah.
social status, your job, your beliefs, your family life, even how legal disputes were handled. It could all be governed by these specific localized community rules and rituals.
Exactly. It underscores that history isn't just about the big events or the famous figures. It's lived in the granular details of daily life, custom, and belief. And it prompts you to consider how documents like this, despite their historical context and limitations, provide invaluable material for understanding the layers of culture and identity that have evolved over time.
So as you, our listener, go about your day, maybe you'll find yourself thinking about that man who ran away from the tintometer. Or the idea of a mock marriage with a brass vessel, or the belief that, obscene carvings on a temple car can actually protect you from bad luck. It's those human-specific details that tend to stick with you, I find.
Absolutely. And maybe it makes you wonder what other aspects of these detailed historical accounts might pique your curiosity or make you look at the world around you just a little differently. That's the enduring value, I think, of taking a deep dive into sources like this one.
Absolutely. Well, until the next deep dive,